Now, she's on the other side of the railing, just a little bit away from near certain death. This individual is going to intervene, and there will be a little bit of a struggle. And I want to focus your attention on two details of her behavior. One is how much or how little she struggles against the rescuer. In other words, how hard does she fight for death? That's one thing. And then the other thing is, as she's pulled over the railing, focus your visual attention on her legs. What do her legs say about her body's state regarding desire for life versus death? All right, so I've hit play here, and now we're going to see what happens. Again, nobody's hurt, much less killed here. Here's the struggle. How hard does she fight? And then here, watch her legs. And then he literally tugs her over the railing, and he stays there with her. He literally sat on her stomach so that she would not be at danger. She'd be safe until the California Highway Patrol arrived about a minute later to take over. What I think this indicates is somebody who is very intent on death. That's why she's there. That's why she's arranged for this. That's why she's on the other side of the railing in an extremely dangerous, precarious point. And there's a part of her, very deeply ingrained part of her, that's afraid of death. And we saw that in the lack of energy in the struggle and in the legs kicking in and fighting, or aiding at least, in rescue. This is not an uncommon occurrence. I've got a whole archive of such incidents that are captured on security footage. Where are we in terms of time? It's 8 o'clock. If I went to 8:30, that would be all right. All right, I'll show one more. Even more dramatic, but also in which nobody is hurt, much less killed. Here too, I'm going to leave the sound off. I've paused it here just to linger over the date of this incident. It occurred in July. You can see the date and the year, but my point here is of July. I'm not sure how this goes here in Northern Ireland, but I can tell you in the States. We're coming up into November, December, and January. The media in the States will run articles that say something along the following lines. Everybody watch out. We're coming into the holiday season. It's suicide season. Suicides because we're into the holiday season. That's not true. That's the opposite of the truth. In the Northern Hemisphere, where we are, in the U.S., where you all are, and around the world, in the Northern Hemisphere, the peak is in May, June, and July. The low point is in November, December, and January. There are local variations, of course, like there are with anything, but as a general rule, that's true. Now, just to follow out that point, I'll get back to this video, but the Northern Hemisphere, the peak is May, June, July. If that has to do with the onset of the spring season, then the peak should be 6 months shifted in the Southern Hemisphere, because their spring is 6 months shifted. They're having their spring right now. If it's about spring, then their peak should be now, and indeed it is. The peak in the Southern Hemisphere is also in the spring. It just so happens that their spring is in October, November. It's about spring. It's not about the month per se. It's about the time of year. Now, as to why that's true, we don't have that nailed down, but I would suggest one possibility. To do something like what we're about to see takes energy and arousal. You have to be aroused to do something as daunting and fearsome as face your death. It takes energy. Energy peaks in the spring. For humans, for organisms, plants worldwide, that's the energy peak. Suicide takes energy. Maybe that's one reason that there's a spring peak around the world. Again, though, that's just speculation, not worked out. This is from a memoir written by an American named Tina Zahn. Ms. Zahn wrote the memoir and then posted this video to her website that was promoting her book. And what this is of an incident that almost resulted in her death on this date. Backstory is that Ms. Zahn is about 35 at the time of this incident, and she had had already 15 or so distinct episodes of major depressive disorder, which just from knowing that alone, you know, that many episodes in a young life, it's a severe illness. Underlying severity of her illness is pretty grave. Of course, most of her episodes are suicidal in nature, also an indicator of severity. One of her past episodes, catatonic in nature. In other words, she completely slowed down to the point where she didn't move at all. She was immobile during one of her episodes. Obvious indicator of underlying severity of illness. However, the episode is not characterized by being slowed down. On the contrary, she's revved up, she's agitated, she's edgy, she's been nervous and sleepless for days. She's at home. Her relatives are looking after her. She has mentioned repeatedly her desire to drive to this bridge and to jump to her death from it. They take their eyes off of her. They're at home for a couple minutes, during which she dashes out of the home, jumps into her car, and speeds away. Behavioral details are important here. She runs to her car. She skids out of the driveway, speeds to the bridge. Behavioral details suggesting intent and resolve and purpose. Family calls the police and say, "We think she's on her way to this bridge, please intervene." The police find her weaving through traffic, and what we're going to see is when she gets up to the bridge, the police cruiser with a video camera, automatic in the U.S., is behind her, and then we're just going to see what happens as she gets out of her vehicle and the police intervene. Again, nobody's hurt here, much less killed. All right, so that's her car. I'm going to pause it again and make a couple of comments. This is at the top of a very tall bridge, clearly sufficient to cause death should she have jumped. Stop it even right here. That's been 1 to 2 seconds of a sample of her behavior. But even from those 1 or 2 seconds, I think a couple of inferences are possible. First of all, she's not in the biggest hurry that you can ever imagine. There's no running, there's no frantic nature here. There was at home, but not here. Secondly, most people who are fleeing from something in their cars, like fleeing from the police after they've perpetrated a crime, they don't shut the door. They open the door and flee. She rather deliberately closed the door. Just a couple of behavioral samples. Main thing I want you to focus in on, though, does she run? Does she walk fast? Or does she slow down quite a bit? And number two, does she hesitate at the rail? Police, what's going to happen here is the police is going to run over and save her at the last moment. So is she running? Is she slowed down? And the hesitation, 1, 2.5 seconds. She in fact jumps and is saved, barely at the last moment, by a courageous, extremely well-trained, and extremely physically powerful police officer. He's the reason she's alive. To this day, she's alive. incidentally. This was in 2004. She would have died on that day were it not for him. But the reason he had a chance to save her was because she hesitated a little bit. She wasn't fast enough. She wasn't running. She wasn't even walking fast, and she hesitated at the railing 2.5 seconds. Lots of people, including captured on film in Eric Steele's The Bridge, they don't hesitate at all. Not 2.5 seconds, not at all. Those are the ones that have gotten so far along in this ability to stare death down that they don't hesitate at all, even in the face of something as scary as this. All right. It may be evident to you already how this immediately contradicts certain myths about death by suicide. For instance, in my view, it's a myth and an unhelpful one that suicide is about cowardice or weakness. This aspect of the model, emphasizing as it does fearlessness of physical pain, physical injury, and physical death, is not compatible with an account emphasizing cowardice or weakness. One or the other of those is true, but they both can't, at least not easily, be simultaneously true. Something's got to give. The evidence is overwhelming that it's fearlessness that's the better explanation than cowardice. I've shown you some anecdotal examples of this. I've left out the growing multitude of scholarly contributions that show this too. So I thought you might be more interested in this than in the scholarly, but it's there too. And if you want the PDFs and the citations and all that, please email me and I'll send them to you. Here's another one that we're going to delve into in a second, but I want to mention it while this slide's up. A lot of people are very convinced that suicide is extremely selfish. Now, it feels that way, it can feel that way to family members who are bereaved and devastated. Their line of thought goes, that was a very selfish thing for that person to put all of us through. That's a very understandable line of thought. However, it's probably not what the person was thinking at the time. They weren't thinking, I'm doing this so as to put everybody through an ordeal. Rather, they're thinking, I'm doing this so as to make everybody better off. They're mistaken about that, tragically and horribly so, but that's what they're thinking. That's not the same thing as selfishness. So right off the bat, these two things kind of go against very common myths about suicidal behavior. I'm going to skip over some of this in the interest of time. We'll touch on this. It's another angle on the role of fearlessness in suicidal behavior, and it involves an eating disorder called anorexia nervosa. There's an intriguing and clinically very important association between anorexia nervosa and death by suicide. The connection is pretty close. The standardized mortality ratio, that's what SMR stands for, is standardized mortality ratio. In some studies, it's as high as 60, which means the chances of early death are 60-fold what they would be otherwise. Pretty lethal psychiatric condition. And you might plausibly enough imagine that's because anorexia nervosa involves self-starvation. And there are some deaths of that nature, but by far most deaths in anorexia are due to what you might think of as conventional death by suicide. The question is, why are those two things associated? One possibility is that anorexia weakens the body, physically weakens the body, and so makes it so that people can't survive any kind of self-injury. It's possible. Another possibility, though, is that if you've been starving yourself for weeks, months, sometimes years, you've developed a kind of capacity to tolerate physical ordeal. In other words, the same fearlessness that I've been talking about tonight. Which possibility is more supported? We had one chance to get a glimpse of this. We looked at this in 239 women with the illness. AN stands for anorexia nervosa. And the women were followed for approximately 15 years, from age 20 more or less to age 35 more or less. Now, among these 239 women, 9 of them died by suicide in that 15-year interval. That's a deceiving number because it seems like it's not that many. 9 out of 239 seems low. It's massively higher than it should be. That number should be 0. In that number of women followed from age 20 to age 35, you should see 0 deaths by suicide, on average, usually. Here we had 9. But our question was different. Our question was, of the 9, were they dying by very low lethality methods? In which case you might think, well, it's about physical frailty. They're fragile, and so they can't withstand any injury. That's why they're dying. Or were the methods extremely violent and lethal? In which case you might conclude, well, this is about fearlessness of bodily harm. The bottom line is that these were some of the most violent and lethal deaths that you'll encounter in this kind of work. I'll just, for that reason, partly tell you about the least lethal method, and it nevertheless is still violent and disturbing. It involved the ingestion of a powerful cleaning agent that is so noxious and so aversive that to ingest any of it is really hard to imagine, but to ingest a full container of it is beyond the pale. But she did that, and she had also been drinking. As you can see there, her blood alcohol content. I don't think you all use that same metric, but that's the equivalent of 10 drinks or so. She's been drinking quite a bit, 8 to 10 drinks, something like that. And the cause of death was the cleaner. It had hemorrhaged her internally, and she bled out, unable to survive that damage. Just like the woman at the bridge, though, she hesitated in the moments after her, in this case, fatal behavior. Here, the hesitation or the flinch involved calling 911, which is our emergency services. So somebody intent on death enough to do something as daunting and fearsome as that, the next behavior that they show is calling 911. Again, showing that even the most suicidal will reach out for life, at least occasionally, and sometimes they're saved by it. Tragically, this young woman was not. All right, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of other myths. I won't be able to get to both of these cases, but I will talk about this first one. The myth has to do with the idea that people regularly die by suicide on a whim, on a mere impulse, without much prior planning or thought or deliberation. There's all sorts of evidence that's accumulating that contradicts this notion. Again, I'm just going to focus on an anecdotal case because it's more translatable, and the cases of a woman named Christine Chubbuck. I'll just blank this out and just tell you the story. Miss Chubbuck was a news reporter on a local channel in Orlando, Florida in the mid-70s. If you had been watching her news report on that particular day, what you would have seen was Miss Chubbuck reporting on a criminal act that occurred at a local restaurant. Somebody had broken in and broken the cash register open and taken a bunch of the money and left. That was the story. They had video footage of the crime scene queued up in the newsroom to play while Miss Chubbuck was reporting the incident. The equipment, however, jammed. It wouldn't run. But she's on live TV, so she had to improvise. And so she said at that moment, well, instead of seeing that violent crime scene footage, what's going to happen instead is you're going to see a violent incident on live TV. At which point she extracted a weapon from underneath the news desk, and she died by self-inflicted gunshot wound on live TV. Leading reporters, other reporters who were reporting on her death, to say, had to be an impulse. How could she have known about the jamming equipment? She improvised that. She couldn't have known about that. So therefore, she must have done that impulsively without having given it much thought. You can see the problems in logic with that line of reasoning. First and foremost, she had a gun with her at a news desk. That's an unusual thing, even in the United States, where we have a lot of guns around. You're not supposed to have them in those kinds of scenarios. That's unusual. But it's not just that. The story actually is that Ms. Chubbuck was very vulnerable to these kinds of behaviors. She had attempted suicide 4 years before. She had talked frequently about it. She had interviewed police officers for different stories about local crime scenes. And she would often ask the officers, oh, by the way, this has nothing to do with the case, but should one want to die by self-inflicted gunshot wound, what's the best anatomical location for that? It's a peculiar question unless you're pondering your own death by those means. She had never been a gun owner, only bought her gun the week before her death. But that's still a week of thinking about it, planning it out, so forth and so on. About 4 days before her death, she had told a joke to her colleagues about how maybe she should shoot herself while broadcasting the live TV news. And then, of course, on the day of her death, she had a bag that she would bring to the news desk regularly. She would have props and materials in there for whatever occasion arose. But on this occasion, she had stowed a gun in the bag. Far from impulsive. It's the opposite. Though the reporting in the day after her death attributed it fully to a whim, spur of the moment. This is a very common kind of thing you see in media reports about death by suicide, is to attribute it to an impulse, a whim, spur of the moment, and then on further investigation, it was nothing of the sort. Why does this occur? A big reason is that suicides come out of the blue and shock everybody. That happens regularly. Happened in my own family. Happens in families around the world. That somebody's fine, so you think, one day, they're dead the next. And in the absence of an explanation for why that happened, impulsivity and spur of the moment kind of fit. Maybe they just had a whim. Maybe they just had an impulse. Trouble is that people can harbor pain, plans for death, intent for suicide. They can keep that private and secret for a long time, sometimes years, certainly weeks or months, and not tell anyone about them, and then all of a sudden enact their thoughts and die to the shock of everybody. All right. And then one last one that I wanted to touch on, and again, it has to do with the selfishness idea. I just wanted to read a quick quote that gets at this view. This is from a long time ago, over 200 years ago, but it's still, you still hear this to this day. Suicide is generally prompted by the most sordid and unworthy selfishness. It's a crime which sacrifices everything on the altar of individual feeling. This view attributes suicide pretty much entirely to selfish motives. And again, this is 1805, but you hear it time and again in 2013, and it's contradicted by all the evidence. For example, this. The DSM-5 has just come out. Some of you are familiar with the nomenclature. Some of you are more familiar with the ICD, I would imagine. And in both, I think, there are conditions named narcissistic personality and antisocial personality. If you were to ask informed clinicians to pick out from the entire DSM system the two most selfish disorders, those are them. Those are the two. Narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. In which conditions are suicide rates the lowest. Antisocial personality, certainly of a kind, and narcissistic personality disorder. That's a contradiction of the selfishness view. If it's about selfishness, the selfish disorder should have the highest rates, not among the lowest, but the reality is quite the opposite. So that's kind of the gist of all that's going on in this kind of work that's come out of my group in Tallahassee, but that's starting to come out around the world, is that we need to take a hard-nosed look at this form of death because it kills a lot of people around the world every year, over 1 million, and it's tractable. We could get better at preventing and treating this just as we've gotten better at preventing and treating heart disease and cancer and stroke. We can do this, but we have to be hard-nosed about it, and we can't let myths like this propagate without very healthy response and reaction and debate. And that's sort of the point that I'm trying to get across. I visited a few of these myths having to do with selfishness, impulsivity, weakness, and cowardice, but there are dozens and dozens of others that are amenable to this same sort of correction in my view. So with that, what time is it? I think I've left about 30 minutes, more or less, for discussion. There might be questions, I would imagine there are for Barbara. And for me, with that, I'll say thank you for your attention. I really appreciate being here.